So we're slowly starting our next session. This session is on theory and practice. The two presenters today are Alison Isadora and Solomiya Moroz. And so I'd like to welcome Alison Isadora, who is going to be talking about performing the practice of composition.
Okay, hello. So I wrote this paper more than a year ago in what seems like another reality now. And since then I've developed a number of works that practically explore the theories presented in the paper. I propose therefore to enter into a dialogue with my original presentation by contextualizing my recent thinkings through examples from compositions. My current research is concerned with performing an ecology of a composition practice, specifically within the confines of contemporary Western art music. My use of the term ecology is informed by Isabel Stenger's proposals on the ecology and interdependence of practices, which resonates with my interest in the fostering of an inclusive compositional practice. When natural ecologists approach a practice as it is, Stenger's interest lies in what it can become. This seems appropriate in a research concerned with the possible creation of new paradigms, rather than the continuation of existing ones. Developing on Brian Masumi's ideas of the social technology of belonging, Stenger's offers a philosophical tool useful for understanding the challenging and fostering role that the score may have in relationship to the other parties. Stenger's identifies the social technology of belonging as being one that can and must address people from the point of view of what they may become able to do and think and feel because they belong. What might the ramifications be for a score, for notations choices, if they are to support a sense of belonging? Furthermore, Stenger suggests that an ecology of a practice should be approached by feeling its borders, experimenting with the questions which practitioners may accept as relevant. In my practice, I attempt to both encourage a sense of belonging between all actants, while also examining the boundaries of the various roles within the practice of contemporary Western art music, aka new music. Before we speculate on what this might entail, it's perhaps helpful to cast an eye on where we are now, our current situation, while recognizing that the concept of a homogeneous we is potentially fraught. Cousins and colleagues use William J. Clancy's definition of situatedness. Where you are, when you do, what you do matters, and make a distinction between three different aspects of situatedness: ecological, epistemic, and social. I'd like to briefly consider the conditions of contemporary Western art music through this triple lens of situatedness. Contemporary Western art music primarily emerges out of institutions teaching the Western classical music tradition. Most musicians and composers involved in new music studied and performed within this heritage. Furthermore, audiences for contemporary music often overlap with those attending historic Western art music concerts. It's not surprising, therefore, that codes of relationship in a new music context are closely connected to their historical relative. These codes determine not only how composers, performers, and listeners position themselves, how they relate to each other, but also their position in relationship to the score. The score itself is not neutral. Bhagwati's insight into the inherent limitations of notational systems and his uncovering of notational bias encourages a situated reading of scores and raises questions regarding the often unconscious perspective of notation in a compositional practice. Historically, in Western art music, the score mediated the relationship between composer, performance, and art and audience. The ontology of the work, the reification of the score, traditionally encouraged a clear delineation between composing and performing roles and resulted in the hierarchic flow of information from composer via the score to the performer and finally audience. In this research, I consider strategies for flattening out some of the long established hierarchies relating to score and attempt to create approaches that support interaction between these actants. Musicologists such as Gurr and Durkin argue that the focus on works rather than performances does not acknowledge the creative input from the performer in the artistic process. Furthermore, this model is unlikely to allow for the potential creative function for the audience or a recognition of contextual situatedness. It's my suggestion that in order to explore the potential of a new music composition practice, it may be useful to transversely consider connections between theories from philosophy and performance studies and practices from our cousins in theatre and dance that enable dynamic, creative roles for all actants. I don't have time to discuss the numerous ontologies currently on offer, but I'd like to suggest that one ontology may not fit all. My interest in a speculative composition practice invites a reinterpretation of ontological roles. So rather than the reification of the score as the work, the expectation of the genius white male composer, hierarchic and stultifying conditions for musicians, physical separation of audience and performers, and performance spaces that encourage these stratifications, I wonder about the role of the entangled composer who coordinates, initiates, co-creates, and acts as guardian, the implicated musician who co-creates and performs, the agental audience who may be an active listener, participant, and co-creator, the situated performance space, and a recontextualized score which operates more as a script and can be interpreted and adapted. Where does the role of the composer finish and the role of the performer begin? Is there overlap, or are we looking at a dynamic intertwining of roles? Can we address the audience through the technology of belonging? And what role can the score inhabit in this entangled landscape? What is starting to emerge is an idea of agency, of a relational process-based ontology. One of the things I'm suggesting is that the act of listening is at the heart of a composition practice. Christopher Small coined the verb musicking to describe the process of music making. Listening is also, he argues, part of musicking. Solomiya elaborates further when she suggests that listening has an exploratory capacity that does not seek to know about the world, but approaches learning as a practice, as a physical and continuous effort to understand momentarily and always again how to live in the between of things. Learning an instrument often starts by learning through imitation, what Dennis Smalley would call transmodal perception, an interaction of different senses. In the West, we generally continue by learning through the interface of written music, the score. However, in many traditions, reading is not part of the equation. Many years ago, I had the great fortune to learn rebab, the Indonesian bowed string instrument, from a master musician. The only problem was that we didn't have a common spoken language. I learned to play the rebab and also much repertoire entirely by imitation. At first, all I tried to do was reproduce what he played. Later on, I started recognizing patterns of similarities, differences, and consequences. The one note that was always performed microtonally sharp, giving it a spectral advantage when the rebab played it at the same moment as the whole gamelan orchestra. Where is the score in this process? Where's the work? As embodied and enculturated memory? Recently, I've been working on a series under the heading Together, which oral and oral transmission play a prominent role, both in the rehearsal and performance processes. For instance, in Together 5 and 9, I, as composer, host, personally instruct the audience during the piece. This process of direct verbal contact is designed to neutralize and demystify the role of the composer, tune the audience, and open up possibilities for co-creation. Oral transmission may also occur between species, and in several recent works, birdsong has been the primary oral score. In the Corona spring of 2020, I began recording the song The Blackbird, living in my shed in the garden. During this anthropause, the Blackbird song had an added poignancy. It was something we shared, something that invited a specific attention to our situation. I slowed down the bird song and the melody which emerged became the basis for the piece. Neighbours were invited to musically participate, and I composed parts for more than 15 inhabitants. Local professional musicians and amateurs performed together from their gardens, their balconies, their open windows. The potential audience, everyone else in the block, received sheet music for singing the chorus, an invitation to prepare bird whistles and download a Blackbird recording for the performance, and a graphic score. The audience score gave an overview of the work and also stimulated explicit forms of listening. Graphic elements were incorporated, both as a tool to provide greater accessibility and to offer a visually stimulating environment. Understanding that our senses do not work independently of each other, I trust that this visual information will inform the musicking practice. By incorporating various forms of notation for different actants, I hope to stimulate people with different levels of music reading expertise to participate in the reading and performing of the score and attend to the moment. Listening in time, to time, through time. And as Einstein noted, space and time are interconnected, which leads me back to situation, space-time in a composition practice. Content and context are intertwined. In an age of increased globalization, attention to situational specificity may encourage a compositional practice that responds to context and stimulates diversity. If we recognize that the score is not objective, but situated, how might this influence our score-making process? Zealandia is a bird sanctuary in a valley within the city of Wellington with a 500-year plan, the time it takes a rimu, an endemic tree, to mature. Within the sanctuary, I hear endemic birds, but also sparrows and blackbirds, what we in Aotearoa call exotics, introduced by English colonials. And there's a plane overhead, and the ubiquitous sound of suburban New Zealand, the motor mower. We're still in the city, but the audio balance is altered. Our listening incorporates an acknowledgement of the human influence, while we hear a whisper, a tantalizing breath of how this valley was, and what it will hopefully one day again become. We listen in time. We listen situationally, historically, geologically, mythologically, musically, bodily. Can we hold different ways of listening in our attention at the same time? And what might this mean for the type of score that we create? Sounding the Tui, together number 9, was premiered in Zealandia this year and represents an intense multi-species dialogue. Recordings of an endemic songbird, the tui, served as the core material on various levels, as an oral score for the singers, as a visual and oral score for the audience, using a frequency analysis program, inspiring graphic cue sheets for public participation. In this work, I attempted to contextualize new music in a way that would encourage ecologically situated and dialogic listening, also by people unfamiliar with new music. Nicholas Cook proposes seeing scores as scripts in response to which social relationships are enacted, rather than texts within which social relationships are encoded. And I'd like to extrapolate on this to also include the score as script wherein musical and extra musical contributions from actants are integrated, and where different forms of listening may be enacted. The score script has the capacity to interact, to create a complex web of connections. As Harris notes, beyond theorizing the score in terms of notation, much can be learned from reconceptualizing the score as relationship. I'd like to suggest then an ontology of the score that embraces an entangled agential realism. Who and what is implicated in the different processes inherent in the score? The creation, performance, and documentation process. In this context, the notion of sympoiesis may provide a useful conceptual tool. Fischer-Lichter describes autopoietic relationships between the performer and audience, the feedback loops present to some extent in all performance situations. Donna Haraway, however, suggests that nothing is completely self-organizing, and developed the term sympoiesis, that enfolds autopoiesis and generatively unfurls and extends it. An example of this model of making with can be found in Together number 5, in which both musicians and audience relate to the piece through the parameter of their own heartbeat, which acts as an embodied but involuntary personal pulse generator. The heartbeat becomes an embodied score for both musicians and audience. The audience create relationships between the rhythm of their heartbeat and those of the musicians around them, listen and respond to an entangled co-creation. Could we call this diffractive listening? listening to a performance through the pulse of one's own body, listening to patterns of difference that make a difference. My hybrid scores involve actants and creating situational texts, formal musical decisions, and collective musicking. Through creating works with multiple layers of score that invite engagement, I hope to encourage a social technology of belonging, new ways of listening, and shared compositional responsibility. Karen Barad notes that responsibility is a matter of the ability to respond, listening for the response of the other, and an obligation to be responsive to the other, who is not entirely separate from what we call self. What if we decide we're all in this together? I'd like to end with a quote from Isabel Stengers. The problem for each practice is how to foster its own force, make present what causes practitioners to think and feel and act, which may also produce experimental togetherness amongst practices, a dynamics of pragmatic learning of what works and how. This is the kind of active, fostering milieu that practices need in order to answer challenges and experiment changes, that is, to unfold their own force. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. That was a wonderful presentation. I have to say, I really enjoyed your paper, and I think it's of tremendous value to this community. I would like to first open things up to questions. Is there anybody who, I think you can either post a question in the chat. Oh, Rama, great.
Hi, thank you. That was a really, I loved your presentation very much. I'm really interested in this idea about co-creation and this kind of, communal kind of music making that includes the audience as well. And of course, it reminds me a little bit of music situations where people are dancing as well, is that there's this kind of co-creation of an event in that way as well. But and I think of that as a kind of socially already existing structure that exists, where we enter in and we know that we are going to enter into a communal event, whereas in a more traditional concert making, it's sometimes difficult to bridge that gap. And I think there's a really beautiful future for this, and I'm just wondering how you felt, or if you felt any resistance from the audience in participating, or how do you work with these kinds of this tension there?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting topic, and certainly through my research, as I continue to do this, I get I start to think about how to tune the audience, maybe, is the thing that I'm thinking about at the moment, is how you set up a situation that people are going to be open to something like that. I mean, one is how you even publicize the event, if people know that's going to happen or not. But the other thing is what I'm seeing as part of my role as composer, and even as part of the score, is some kind of oral transmission, communication that I'm actually talking before the piece or during the piece to try to tune audience. And the next piece I'm making, I plan to actually be doing that before. It's also to do with musicians to think this way too, because it means that they're also having to think about how they relate to the audience in a different way. And that also requires a certain kind of tuning in how you're going to respond to each other.
Well, thanks. I see Georg has his hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Alison, for this wonderful presentation. I'm also very much interested in the notion of situatedness. And you had these three categories that you mentioned, that these weren't your own, but you had mentioned them: sociological, epistemological, and ecological situatedness. I wonder whether you find that this list is exhaustive, or can you think of other forms of situatedness that are relevant to us?
It's not sociology, it's socially. Socially, it's epistemic, okay. Socially, and ecological. Yeah. I'm sure there are. I think there's still a lot inside those three that we can think about. I think that Western music has usually been kind of tied up with epistemological and hasn't looked so much at ecological or sociological, social situatedness. So I think there's still plenty within those three that we can think about, but I'm sure there are other ones. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, there's a lot to discuss here. I am aware of the time, so I would say that maybe we should move on to the next speaker. I definitely have a few questions for you, but I'll reach out to you on Slack, and I would encourage anybody else to continue that discussion there. So, Solomiya, are you ready to go?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I will, share my screen now.
And I see that you put a couple of links in the chat.
Yes, it's because I don't think I can access chat during the presentation.
Okay.
So it's just, it follows my presentation, and I will say what they are as we start. Oops, I think you see a wrong screen.
It looks good. Oh.
Did you see presentation notes or?
Yes. No notes.
No notes. Oh, okay. Sorry. I thought I shared that. Have to go back. Sorry about that. Oops, I lost Zoom. Where are we? Oh, I see. Sorry. Oh, you see my presentation notes.
Now we see your whole browser or your whole window. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I think it was working for a second there, though.
Yes, I think it was fine when you pressed play.
Okay.
We saw the real, what we should see.
Okay, sorry, I'll do it again. How about now?
It looks good.
Okay, perfect. Okay, technology. Well, it was really great to be here at a conference on notation and technology. But my presentation actually follows really nicely the one we just heard, and it was really interesting one, and I will for sure be checking out the paper later. It talks about kind of the opposite of notation a little bit, about the embodied research that could go along with notation or can just exist on its own. So in this research, in this paper, I will talk about, I will introduce myself, my background. I will talk about embodied research as part of notated and open score, and I will briefly conclude on where this leaves me in my compositional thought on embodied research and notation and open score. So my background, I was researching for 5 years at the University of Huddersfield in music composition, and I was interested in physical gestures and composing with gestural controllers and sensors. But as I was doing this work, I realized there was a lot of collaborative effort in it, and I was actually a lot of the times producing new forms of knowledge with the performers, meaning that they were contributing their own responses to my provocations, my sounds, my musical ideas. So for me, I became really interested in this idea of embodied research, where the primary site of investigation are the bodies of performers individually or in relation to each other. And I take this definition from Ben Schwarz's in What a Body Can Do, where he treats the technique that anyone's body acquires as knowledge and practice as research that one engages with in order to gain insight into new embodied knowledge. And of course, this provokes some problems, as we previously heard in this idea of, and also we heard yesterday about the idea of a musical work. So my pieces no longer resided solely with myself as the creator of these works. They were also shared between performers who were contributing their knowledge, their techniques, and therefore the pieces no longer follow this idea of paradigm reproductions of what Nicholas Cook talks about in Beyond the Score, which is that a piece will not be reproduced as composer ideally imagined it every time that it is performed. And of course, it's actually a myth and it never happens this way, but for some reason in music, we always think that it could happen that way. Well, it could. Anyways, to talk about this further, I decided to look into, well, actually, a lot of the ideas about embodied research came with my making of works. So I looked into the idea of imaginary gestures, which were basically the performer's response to the sounds that I sent them. And I will play for you a little excerpt of this research that I did with Quasar Saxophone Quartet from Montreal. And I sent them different field recordings from construction sites. And I asked them to embody them physically with movements of their bodies and also sonically with their saxophones. And I also should say that I built this insight into this research from Denise Peters' research in Graz with dancers and their sensory motor response to sounds in a kind of controlled environment. So the dancers were making sounds as if they were triggering them, even though there was no actual triggering of sounds. So this idea really inspired me to look into the idea of asking performers to interpret movements through gestures in their bodies. Sorry, I had to skip through for the lack of time, but so just to say that I sent them 9 different field recordings and I asked them to embody them physically as well as sonically. And so these were the video responses I received from them. So there was a lot of back and forth process of exchanges. So I say I made this piece more in collaboration with the Quasar rather than just purely myself as a composer. So in the end, the score was organized around scenes, and I guess following Nicholas Cook's idea of script, my score became kind of like a script where different parts indicated in which parts I would like the video documentation that they made or the gestures from there to be enacted, and in which parts the sonic responses to sounds that they already knew, and also composed sections by me and some improvisational sections by Quasar. And actually this was interesting because the musicians had organized themselves both physically and sonically in their responses to the field recordings. So this became part of the thematic content of the piece, which became about labor and work organization. And in it, I also use a quote from Paul Mason's Post-Capitalism, which talks about work and organization of labor. So the score, if you're interested, so this is just a section of the score, and actually the full score is the first link I posted in the chat. But the score looks like I said, like a combination of sections, and it was some of it was text, like asking them to gesture like they did in video 1 of the excerpts you saw before, or to play the soundtrack. And actually the listening part was easier, I guess. Well, both parts were actually quite easy for musicians to perform live because they had already embodied these moments both sonically and physically, but they could hear this field recording as well. And actually it's the second link, the YouTube link, if you are interested to see the whole piece. And other parts of the score looked actually a combination of notation and also asking them where you see the circle and numbers for specific gestures from the videos. And those were there just as a reference because, like I said, they became kind of their own movements. They were their own movements, so they already knew what they were. They just had to reference them if they forgot or something. So from this research, it became quite clear to me that I was interested in this sensory motor response to sound, and imaginary gestures became kind of like a lead into more extensive research with embodiment. And for that, I wanted to go a step further and work with theater performers for whom embodied practice is kind of part of their techniques and knowledge. So using previous disciplinary knowledge to work with them, and also this actually also proved the point that there's still new possibilities that are still possible with this kind of interdisciplinary collaboration, where new embodied techniques and movements emerged. And so I call these boundary objects. And boundary objects actually has a background in theater and dance. It was deployed often in foresight dance company practice. So their objects or concepts, although jointly referred to by a community of dancers, could be used differently by each participant. So for us, they were the combinations of sound and movement, because how we had organized ourselves in these improvisatory sessions was that we were pairs leading each other. So there was a pairs, they produce repeatable techniques of sound and leading movement and movement leading sound. So, so in a way, initially it started quite clean, where you could tell the difference of who is proposing sound or movement to whom, but eventually it became quite mixed and entangled because musicians were also moving and dancers were also using their voice, theater performers were also using their voice. So quite quickly it was becoming quite complex. Yet the objects, the boundary objects, or these repeated instances of movement and sound remained flexible. They were easily recognized by participants, but each time they could be differentiated and changed. Yeah, so this actually helped to structure our work conceptually in relation to future presentations. This idea that there are these clear combinations that could recur. So these are just some of the movements that we did. These are the embodied combination of sound and movement, the boundary objects, and I will just show you, quickly introduce them. Basically, the first one is the straight line movement, which divides the largest space into a grid, and there are rattles and wood blocks used, and it's usually pairings of a musician and a theater performer. And for the next one, it was more of a circular movement using high vocals, where sometimes both theater practitioners would sing and musicians would play. And there's a cymbal somewhere used in the space, but of course this combination would change as well, depending on the space we were in or what came before. So they were very flexible, and I will play just a little bit of it. The third combination of movement and sound, or boundary object, was the alternating movements carried out in pairs. So members alternate leadership roles where sound leads movement or vice versa. And there's also usually a drum with a brush used in the space, and typically it's highly energetic section. I will just play the beginning, but you have to imagine the energetic part later. Oh, it didn't play. Ah, I'm sorry. That's strange. Sorry, for some reason I cannot trigger it. Oh, there it is. So I would have to skip because I think I'm running out of time. So the tools that helped us structure this embodied score. So just to make sure it is clear that there was no notated score in this work. It was all based on these embodied moments, the boundary objects of our improvisations. So what helped a lot was actually, well, obviously was the video documentation, which helped us to look back and reference what had happened in the sessions. But also it helped as a supplement for discussion and further reflection with each other. So the previous disciplinary training from theater performers, their embodied techniques and theater exercises actually from Grotowski theater, where we use exercises like walk and stop, which is receiving impulses from partners and developing spatial awareness, motion exercises following dynamic of the partner, and duet conversations from social presencing theater. Transcription of sonic content of some of the boundary objects, such as circular movements, where there are high vocal leaps and alternating movements. It also helped to understand the musical material because everything was becoming quite entangled in these improvisatory moments. And of course, also each individual's contribution or their own phenomenological account of what was happening in these moments helped to understand this. Because as I mentioned, it was becoming quite entangled in responses. So something that helped me understand this further was this quote from Deleuze, where he talks about affects, percepts, and concepts are three inseparable forces running from art into philosophy and from philosophy into art. So actually in the paper, I talk about boundary objects being these packets of sensations, these individual reactions in a moment of improvisation, something that quite not graspable in a moment of doing so, but possible upon reflection. And thinking about these philosophical implications also help thinking about how to structure this open process-based work and performances. So how we thought about presenting it was again relying on boundary objects and their characteristics. So if we go back thinking about the first boundary object, which was based out of linear lines, we decided to elements of vocal linear percussive movement could be represented through straight lines of light. So there was light set on ends of the stage, and the slower circular movements were represented more through this kind of circular floodlighting in the second scene, and the third scene, which was represented through energetic exchanges, was presented with a corridor of light in a performance. Of course, these could be related to other aspects of a performance space in the future, so they do not have to stay the same, as the work is flexible and constantly evolving. So in conclusion, it was interesting to work with these pieces because it proved to me the possibility to retain the embodied score, the imaginary gestures between participants for future presentations where they stayed with the performers for quite a long time, and you did not need to notate them in scores. So yeah, so also possibility of new embodied knowledge arising from already previously established improvisatory moments of sound and movement. In the future, I think it would be interesting to look into the sensory motor response to sound from musicians in more kind of motion capture type of environment, to see how musicians would respond through sound and instrumental improvisations there. And also I'm open to using scores for some instances of notation in these kind of research moments. However, I think for the type of work that I did with motion studies, the last piece, it's more interesting to keep the work as an embodied score. Thank you very much, and I am open for questions.
Thank you so much for that presentation. That again was really wonderful work. I really enjoyed the paper, and I think it's really nice to put these two presentations in context together and have a chance to think them through each other. So, are there any questions from anybody? Can you raise your hand or put something in the chat? Yes, Rama.
Hi. I don't mean to be always asking questions, but this I'm really into. That was great. Thank you so much. I'm curious to know more about your experience. I sort of similar to I think my question to Alison is this entanglement of these different like the sound making and movement. I'm curious. So you were talking a lot about this entanglement between these actions, and I'm wondering if you could go a little deeper into explaining. I don't know. I just want to know. I'm curious to know more about, for instance, what was it becoming? I wasn't clear if you felt like it was becoming too dense, this entanglement, and that it was difficult to read, or I'm just curious to know more about, like, whether you felt like, were they fusing into a single object, or were they, yeah, I don't know. I'm just curious to hear more about that.
Well, yes, it's kind of the part that's interesting about this is because I did feel like they were becoming fused, and so some mediation in terms of our devising process helped in terms of determining which combination of movement and sound boundary objects definitely recur and help us kind of feel grounded in what is happening for performance situations. But also it was nice because this work took time over a longer period of time, something we don't actually ever get to do in music, which is so sad because I feel this work needs to be done. So we were very comfortable with each other and also sharing our responses, our accounts of how we feel in different moments of going through the work or improvising together helped to kind of build this kind of trust, I guess. So when something was happening in the moment of a presentation, you just feel completely comfortable and completely confident that what you do and how you respond to certain things, certain movements or sounds will be, you're completely open and really kind of interested to receive it. So they're kind of like the fun parts because you don't know what they will be. Yeah, so I don't know if I'm answering this correctly, but basically I think time helped in building trust that these moments of chance that will happen in the performance will kind of open up our work to even, a better performance or a better satisfaction with it. So they're like, yes, completely speculative, but they're just out there, these entanglements, you can't help.
Yeah, totally. Cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's also, again, a really nice point about that in music, we don't often have this opportunity to work like that. I actually had I organized something some years ago and found it to be extremely, I'm looking for the right adjective, but it was a wonderful experience to have like a regular working group to develop these pieces, much like you would in dance or theater, and I don't see why music can't also be like that.
Thank you. I see Alison has a question.
Thank you so much. It's really super interesting, and I look forward to see where you're going with this. I was wondering if you had worked with dancers also, and if there was some kind of difference in the way that theatre or dance participants might respond.
Yes, I didn't talk a lot about my background, but previously I did work with dancers, but not extensively. I made like one kind of score in which actually dancers asked me, can you be in the performance? And I was like, okay. And before that, I had not done it in such a way, but now I am kind of always, most of the time, participating also with different artists on stage. Yeah, so this kind of opened me up to see the process and how long it does take to make a work together in the studio, and these kinds of relationships that are built was something that I always felt was severely lacking in music and something I wanted to work with.
Yes, no, that's for me also a constant drama. I was sorry.
sorry, yeah, I was just saying yes.
I was just thinking about this embodiment of scores and how that comes maybe more naturally to dance and theatre in a way, and wondering how the musicians, if they did write things down, if they needed to have notational, or whether they did keep it just in their bodies.
No, yes, we kept it just in our bodies, but for myself, for my own interest, I felt like, well, I almost did not need to do any transcriptions from the improvisational sessions. I just wanted to see, because I'm a composer, what happens musically and structurally. And so I did transcribe some sections, which helped to remember which specific sounds we use with different boundary objects. So was that the question? So basically, no, I did not need to remind Colin, who was the percussionist in the sessions, what he was doing. He remembered it. So it becomes really quickly embodied. The sound and movement somehow really work well together. Yeah, it helps with memory, embodied memory. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
All right, well, so we're in a weird situation where we don't have another talk. We only had 2 for this session, but given these 2 talks, we're now out of time. So I would say that we would take an early break, since we're short on breaks, generally speaking, in this conference. I don't see any reason why people can't stay here and just continue to chat if there's more to discuss. And of course, that can move over to Slack as well. But thank you both so much. That was a really wonderful pair of presentations. And again, I really enjoyed that. So yeah, thank you. And thanks for the nice questions.